A friend in Europe reminded me that on March 24, 2011, a group of well-known Russian astrologers, shamans, and parapsychologists gathered to discuss forecasts for the near and distant future. Since almost nothing of importance in Russia occurs without the state or the FSB having a finger in the pie, so to speak, it is worth taking notice of Russian predictions, whatever the source. Readers are directed to the 2011 Pravda, article titled Third World War to Begin During Winter Games in 2014. A wise man once said, "Never make predictions, especially about the future." Indeed, the article contains predictions that obviously did not come true. Anyone who monitors major predictions about the future will find a very poor track record in 99 out of 100 cases. What is most curious, however, is that participants of the aforementioned 2011 meeting offered up a date for the beginning of World War III that already has some of us jittery. According to the article, war supposedly begins in March 2014, during or shortly after the Olympic Games in Sochi. Since there have been bombings in Russia, and since Russia has threatened to take unspecified actions against Saudi Arabia if terrorists bomb the Sochi Games, there may be reason to worry. We know that supposed Islamist terror bombings in Russia have, in the past, been carried out by the FSB along with other false flag operations. We know that Saudi Arabia is the key to the West oil lifeline. Is Russia setting up a pretext for war? In the case of the assembled astrologers and parapsychologists in Russia, how did they arrive at the March 2014 date for the start of World War III? The best predictions are often made by those who have sources on the inside. If an astrologer is trying to boost himself, wouldn't it be prudent to have friends in the special services or general staff? After all, such predictions would greatly strengthen the livelihood of any self-respecting astrologer or parapsychologist. Therefore, we may ask if the Russian astrologers are merely reflecting an open secret within Russia's ruling circles. As it happens, an answer to this question is ready at hand. I received a note from a practicing non-Russian astrologer about the March 2014 timeframe for World War III. Apparently, in the lore of astrology, 2014 looks rather frightening. In the previous version of this present article, I had mistakenly assumed the aforementioned astrologer was concerned about events in March, and I took that to mean there was nothing else behind the Russian astrological predictions except astrology. Silly me. The story is even more interesting insofar as there are no, I am told, astrologically justified reasons for the Russian astrological prediction. Found nothing especially frightening about March 2014. And this leaves me wondering out loud. Why were the Russian astrologers, who regularly serve the Russian General Staff and KGB, registering concerns for March 2014? Again, we may be looking at something that has more to do with inside knowledge of intentions which, in trying to look credible, must reflect what superiors already believe is set to happen. This is significant, and perhaps other experts can contact me and weigh in on the matter. It is not a question here of believing in astrology, by the way. It is a question of why Russian astrologers and shamans would understand the Winter Olympics and March of 2014 as the beginning of World War III. So when is the next World War going to start? Let us turn to someone who made 148 falsifiable predictions in his 1984 book and got roughly 94% of them right. I am referring to KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn. His predictions were based on strategic insight, years of study, and personal knowledge. In a 1978 memorandum to the CIA, Golitsyn warned that America and NATO were in grave danger because the Soviet Union had adopted a long-range strategy that the West knew nothing about. According to Golitsyn, a trap is being laid by the communist policymakers which will be exploited when the USSR carries out a deceptive liberalization of its regime. Written in 1978, more than a decade before the revolutions that swept through Eastern Europe, Golitsyn's warning was scoffed at. With few exceptions, the editors of Golitsyn's 1984 book affirmed, those Western officials who were aware of the views expressed in the manuscript of Golitsyn, especially on the Sino-Soviet split, rejected them. In fact, over the years it became increasingly clear to the author that there was no reasonable hope of his analysis of communist affairs being seriously considered in Western official circles. While Nancy Reagan consulted astrologers, the White House and intelligence community weren't touching Golitsyn with a 10-foot pole. In fact, the poor man was defamed in publication after publication. The accuracy of his predictions was vociferously denied. And here we are, 20 years after the liberalization of the Soviet bloc, with a KGB officer nominally in charge of Russia. If anyone cares to notice, the liberalization was false indeed, if only because Russia has not been liberalized. Even the former satellite countries exist in a curious state between liberalization and ongoing control by hidden communist structures. What did this liberalization accomplish in the end? If anyone cares to notice, NATO has been gradually disarming while President Barack Obama is working to shrink the U.S. nuclear arsenal to a fraction of its current size. And why is this important? In a 1973 memorandum to the CIA, Golitsyn wrote, "One can also expect a concealed communist offensive through their agents of influence in order further to undermine the establishment, especially the Pentagon, the so-called military-industrial complex, and the American Special Services, and further to reduce the authority of the president in the military field and to reduce expenditure on defense. The further weakening of the United States," wrote Golitsyn, "will lead to communist bloc military superiority over the West through secret Sino-Soviet cooperation. The result of such superiority is not hard to guess." According to Golitsyn's 1973 memorandum, the Soviet and Chinese rocket strike units and strategic bombers will make a surprise raid on Pearl Harbor lines on the main government and military headquarters of the leading Western countries and on their missile sites. The main idea will be to knock out the primary Western sources of retaliation and to paralyze, at least for a short period, their physical ability to take a decision on retaliation. Golitsyn further wrote, "Although, of course, this vision of a surprise attack on the West is speculation, it is my belief that it is definitely in the realm of possibility, given that it has been the subject of study by the KGB and should in any case be prepared for. There are a number of factors that must be clarified before we continue our analysis of when World War III is likely to begin. First, we must reckon with the diversionary role played by Arab terrorism in advance of a nuclear attack on the United States. A pre-war diversionary phase, known within Soviet military circles as Grey Terror, was outlined by GRU defector Viktor Suvorov in Spetsnaz, the inside story of the Soviet Special Forces. On page 196 of the book, Suvorov defined Grey Terror as a series of large and small terrorist operations, the purpose of which is, before actual military operations begin, to weaken the enemy's morale, create an atmosphere of suspicion, fear, and uncertainty, and divert attention of the enemy's armies and police forces to a huge number of different targets." Suvorov further stated that Grey Terror is a kind of terror that is carried out in the name of already existing extremist groups not connected in any way with the Soviet Union, or in the name of fictitious organizations. If alarm bells are not ringing in your head at this point in our discourse, then you haven't been reading with sufficient attention. For here we have a GRU defector describing a diversionary strategy that precedes World War III. The book in which this description takes place was written 13 years before the spectacular terrorist attack of 9/11, which KGB defector Alexander Litvinenko hinted was a KGB operation. Before his poisoning with polonium-210, Litvinenko also said that leading figures in al-Qaeda were KGB agents, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current chief of al-Qaeda. It is almost certainly not a coincidence that al-Qaeda's operations against the United States closely resemble Grey Terror. If we consider the Soviet role in creating and supporting international terrorism during the past half-century, and the testimony of communist bloc defectors like Ion Pacepa, the purpose of the terror edifice comes sharply into focus. In essence, if we are reading the situation correctly, the first act of war has already happened. It was accomplished through a covert mechanism so that the victim of the attack could not properly identify the true source of the attack. The question of when all-out war begins, however, is still not answered. In November 1999, while conversing with GRU defector Stanislav Lunev, I admitted to being puzzled by the exact mechanism of a Soviet surprise nuclear strike. How would they pull it off? Lunev said, "If you ever hear that Arab terrorists have attacked an American city with nuclear weapons, don't believe it." I asked Lunev why I should disbelieve such a thing. He replied, "Because it will be my people. It will be Spetsnaz." I asked him what would happen after such a nuclear attack. He said that a period of weeks or months would elapse. Then the rockets from Russia will arrive. This last statement puzzled me a great deal at the time, but does not puzzle me today. The United States government has sometimes, if not often, been manipulated by Russian agents of influence. Diana West has written a best-selling book to remind us of this fact. Time is always required for such agents to guide a nation's policies toward national disadvantage. This would also be true for a country suffering a diversionary nuclear terror attack. Considering how easily we have been manipulated in the past, consider what a diversionary nuclear strike could accomplish if the right people were in the White House. This leads me to consider another communist bloc defector. His name was Jan Sejna, and in 1982 he wrote the following words about Russia's long-range strategy. Soviet ambitions towards the United States were aimed at the extinction of capitalism and the socialization of America. The main strategic goals on the road to their fulfillment were the withdrawal of the USA from Europe and Asia, the removal of Latin America from the United States' sphere of influence and its incorporation into the socialist bloc, the destruction of United States influence in the developing world, the reduction of American military power to a state of inferiority, the advent to power in Washington of a transitional liberal and progressive government, and the collapse of the American economy. Before a missile can be launched, the U.S. political system will be infiltrated. See the work of Trevor Loudon, and the U.S. economy will be sabotaged. See the work of Kevin Freeman. We can also see there is no reason to attack the United States with nuclear weapons until most or all of these goals have been reached. For once these goals are accomplished, the United States will be ready for the oven. In essence, the country will be disarmed and isolated. It will only be a matter of time before the country wakes up and attempts to change course. This is when Russia's nuclear weapons prove useful. That is when you should expect a war to start. All of this does not render an exact date. Instead, it gives us markers on the road ahead. Through these markers, we can track our progress. We can see where we are and where we can expect to be as events unfold. The strange thing, of course, is that socialist bloc defectors have been describing our future for decades. The reason they were able to do this is simple. Strategy works when there is no counter-strategy. The great game follows a pattern set by the side that holds the initiative. In the West, our leaders have denied there is an enemy or an opposing strategy. They are readily diverted into the dead-end policies of the present day. The question that now cries out for clarification has to do with domestic U.S. politics.